A memory is not a story. It is a recording, flawed and degraded, stamped onto living tissue. The stories we tell ourselves are neat, curated things, filed away with clear beginnings and logical ends. A true memory, a raw recording pulled from the grey matter of the dead, is a chaotic artifact. It is a ruin, and my job is to walk through it, to catalogue the fractures and identify the exact moment the structure failed. I am not an archaeologist of the mind. I am a forensic engineer, and the dead are my schematics. My lab has no windows. The walls are lined with dark grey acoustic foam that swallows sound whole, creating a quiet so profound you can feel the pressure of it in your eardrums. The air itself has a texture, chilled and dry, tasting of the ozone from the server racks and the alcohol I use to wipe down my console. This is NORAD Site Gamma, a command bunker buried deep enough beneath the Nevada rock that the world above is a theoretical concept. Here there is only the work. On the polished steel of my workbench lay the schematics of Lieutenant Adrian Croft. The wet drive, officially a cranial data link unit, is a sliver of woven biocircuitry designed to sit against the hippocampus, passively recording sensory input. It's a standard issue failsafe for all flight personnel, a black box for the human operator. This one was crusted with cryochalk, the fine white powder used for field preservation of neural tissue. It had been pulled from Croft's skull 3 hours after his Osprey's fly-by-wire system suffered a catastrophic seizure and drove itself into a mountainside. The official report cited a hardware malfunction. My job was to confirm it by experiencing the last 30 seconds of his life. My interface rig was a custom assembly, a web of silver-tipped microfilaments suspended in a gel-lined cranial cradle. I lowered it over my head, the filaments making cool, precise contact with the ports surgically embedded behind my ears. The system booted with a soft chime, and the workbench became a sea of floating diagnostic data, visible only to me. I calibrated the extraction field, its low-energy magnetic pulses, designed to coax the data from the fragile organic substrate of the wet drive without burning it out. The connection stabilized. The data stream began. I never see a clear image. It's not a film. The feedback comes as phantom sensation, a bleed-through from the source memory, the bitter smell of ozone from a shorted-out console, the high-frequency whine of a failing guidance system stabbing at my inner ear, the jarring, gut-lurching sensation of negative G-forces as the aircraft pitched forward. Through it all, a frantic cascade of corrupted code flashed in my optic field, the aircraft's system language gibbering in its death throes. Then, Croft's final, sharp intake of breath, a spike of adrenaline and cortisol in the biofeed, and a final, crushing impact that registered as a burst of pure white noise across every sensory channel. Connection severed. The phantom sensations evaporated. I archived the data signature. The malfunction was exactly as the report described, a fatal system error. No external influence, just another ghost in another machine. The pneumatic seal on my lab door broke, a sound so out of place in my controlled environment that it made the muscles in my back tighten. Colonel Jasker did not knock. His polished boots made sharp sounds on the deck grating as he strode in, his form-fitting blue service uniform looking like it had been molded from a single piece of rigid fabric. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, from his severe jaw to the crisp fold of his sleeves. "Weir," he said. His voice was like gravel being dropped on concrete. "Task terminated. Pack your mobile rig." I retracted the filaments from the cradle. "Colonel, I've just confirmed the Croft incident. The report is compiling." "Scrub it," he said, his eyes scanning my setup, dismissive of the ghost I had just communed with. "Something else has priority. Your wheel's up in 20. He gestured to the large wall monitor, and it came to life, displaying a tactical map centered on the Mojave Desert. Near the cluster of buildings that marked Edwards Air Force Base, a new icon blinked, a perfect black triangle labeled with a single designation: Zero Locus. 16 hours ago, Jaska began, his voice dropping into the clipped, formal tone of a briefing. An object of unknown origin performed a controlled atmospheric entry descent. It embedded itself a half-mile from the Edwards perimeter. No heat signature on approach, no seismic event on impact beyond what its mass would dictate. It is, for all intents and purposes, a blind spot. An image replaced the map. It was a high-altitude drone shot. The object was a pyramid, achromatically black, its four faces so smooth they seemed to drink the harsh desert light. Its angles were perfect, its edges sharper than any naturally formed object should be. It absorbs all scans, Jaska continued. Radar, LiDAR, thermal, we get nothing back. It also projects a measurable cold zone. The ambient temperature within a 100-meter radius is a consistent 20 degrees Celsius lower than the surrounding desert, regardless of the time of day. Initial attempts to breach the surface with drilling lasers resulted in a simultaneous shutdown of all digital and wireless systems within a 10-mile radius. Everything just went dead. Soldiers on the perimeter reported acute vertigo and phosphenes, flashes of light in their vision. The preliminary MRIs show anomalous electrical activity in their occipital cortices. He zoomed in on a small, brightly lit tent complex near the base of the pyramid, a forward operating base, hastily erected. The problem we need you for, Weir, is Specialist Diaz. He brought up a personnel file, NSA cryptolinguist, top of his field. Diaz was part of the primary analysis team. 12 hours ago, he became what the on-site psych is calling a rogue broadcast. He began speaking compulsively, in a language that doesn't match any known terrestrial or theoretical model. He's also exhibiting compulsive graphomania, writing complex equations in the sand, on his arms, on the tent walls. The math is coherent, but its foundational logic is alien. Jaska finally looked at me, his gaze as direct and penetrating as a drill bit. Standard medical and psychological assessments have yielded nothing. This isn't a breakdown. We believe it's an attack, a signal, a contagion, a weapon. We don't know. But it operates on a neurological level, and that makes it your area of expertise. Your mission is to get to FOB perimeter, perform a live cognitive assessment on Diaz, and determine the nature of this thing. Is it rewriting him? Or is it just reading him? The unspoken question hung in the air between us. If a foreign power or something else entirely could bypass our firewalls and weaponize the human mind itself, every other defense system we had was obsolete. I nodded once, my own analysis of the situation running in parallel. I'll need a direct biofeed link and full-spectrum analysis of his neural output. You'll have it, Jaska said, turning to leave. Don't fail. We can't afford to be blind on this. The door closed, leaving me once again in the quiet. I opened the hardened Pelican case that held my mobile rig. Inside, nested in custom-cut foam, was a more streamlined version of my lab setup. A flexible interface headset, a suite of dermal sensors that read biometrics through the skin, and a portable processing unit with its own shielded power source. I packed it all, my mind already leaving Lieutenant Croft's ghost behind, focusing on a new, far more complex ruin. The VTOL flight was a jarring transition from the deep earth silence of the bunker to the roaring vibration of the transport's engines. Less than an hour later, the ramp lowered, and the air that hit me was an immediate shock. It was the Mojave, so it was dry, but it was also unnaturally cold, carrying no warmth from the late afternoon sun. It was like stepping into a walk-in freezer left open in the desert. The dust didn't swirl. It seemed to hang in the air, suspended and motionless. And there it was. In the distance, maybe a kilometer away, the pyramid dominated the horizon. It wasn't just a black object against the landscape. It was a zone of pure absence, a geometric hole cut into the fabric of the visible world. It did not loom, it negated, and I felt it then. Not a sound, but a low-frequency vibration that bypassed my ears entirely and sank directly into the bones of my skull. I zipped up the collar of my jacket, a useless gesture against a cold that felt like it was coming from inside me. Ahead, a single medical tent was lit from within, a fragile point of light against the growing dusk and the silent, absolute black of the pyramid. That was where they were keeping Specialist Diaz, my next schematic. I walked toward it, the fine desert sand crunching under my boots, the vibration in my skull a steady, unwelcome companion. The med tent was an island of harsh white light against the encroaching desert twilight. Inside, the cold was more profound, clinging to the metal frames of the cots and the surfaces of the medical equipment. Specialist Diaz was strapped to a cot in the far corner, with medical-grade webbing that held him securely without appearing overtly punitive. His eyes, wide and dark, were fixed on a point on the tent's ceiling, unblinking. His fingers twitched ceaselessly against the canvas sheets, tracing invisible, complex patterns. From his throat came a near-constant stream of sound, a series of glottal stops and smooth, sibilant hisses, occasionally broken by long, vowel-like tones that seemed to hang in the air. It was more like the complex chatter of insects than human speech. "He hasn't responded to his name in 6 hours," the on-site medic, a tired-looking captain, murmured to me. "Vitals are stable, if slightly depressed. He just does that." I nodded, unpacking my mobile rig onto a rolling steel tray. "Has he been violent?" "No, sir, passive. It's like the part of him that drives the body is just idling." I placed the dermal sensors on Diaz's temples and neck. They were thin, flexible patches that would give me a live reading of his autonomic functions and basic neural activity without the need for invasive probes. I put on my interface headset, and the world bloomed with an overlay of data. Diaz's biometrics appeared in my vision, a calm sea of green metrics: heart rate 62, respiration slow and even, blood pressure normal. There was no sign of physiological distress. He was a picture of health, aside from the fact that his mind was broadcasting from another reality. I activated the primary cognitive analysis suite, a program designed to map active neurological centers. His language centers were lit up, firing in syntactical patterns as structured as any I'd ever seen. It was grammar without a language, a container built for a meaning I could not access. The patterns he traced with his fingers were not random. My rig's motion capture analysis identified them as a 3-dimensional representation of the equations he'd been scribbling earlier. He was speaking and writing the same message, in 2 different formats, into the empty air. He wasn't mad. He was meticulously, profoundly occupied. For 10 minutes, I watched the data flow, a silent, one-sided conversation. Then, without any physiological precursor, no spike in heart rate, no change in breathing, the stream of alien noise from his throat stopped. His eyes shifted from the ceiling and locked directly onto mine. The focus in them was sudden and total, and for the first time, I felt I was being seen. "The recording is flawed," he said. His voice was perfectly clear, his English unaccented, the tone one of simple, factual declaration. Then, just as quickly, his eyes lost their focus, and the stream of glottal clicks and hisses resumed. Before I could process the implication of his words, a siren tore through the quiet of the fob. The medic's radio squawked to life. Jaska's voice blasted from the small speaker. "All section heads to command. Breach Team 2 is dark." I left my rig monitoring Diaz and followed the medic at a run toward the largest tent in the complex, the ad hoc command post. Inside, technicians hunched over consoles, their faces illuminated by the frantic readouts. Wires snaked across the floor like trip hazards. On the main screen, a dozen video feeds from the breach team's body cams were displayed in a grid. All but 3 were black. The remaining 3 showed a disorienting view of a corridor inside the pyramid. The walls were not built, they appeared to be grown, a dark, achromatically black substance that formed perfect 120-degree angles, creating a honeycomb of intersecting passages. There was no light source, yet the cameras picked up the scene with perfect clarity, as if the air itself were luminous. "What's their status?" Jaska demanded, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Comms are breaking up, sir," a young signals officer replied. "We're getting fragments. Something about environmental inconsistency." As if on cue, the audio from one of the feeds cleared for a moment. "Captain," a young soldier's voice said, thin and strained over the comms. Hold up. I see something." The camera view belonging to that voice dipped, unsteady. On the floor, nestled against the angled black geometry, lay a standard-issue combat helmet. The view moved closer, the soldier's breathing now audible and harsh. The stenciled white letters on the back were stark and unmistakable. Axiom 5, the camera operator's own call sign. A sharp intake of breath crackled over the audio as the soldier's free hand came into frame, reaching up to touch the intact helmet on his own head. "Kestrel, report!" the captain's voice demanded. The camera focused on the object on the floor again, tracing its damage with a horrifying stillness. The helmet's faceplate was a spiderweb of cracks originating from a single point of impact. Worse, a jagged fist-sized hole was punched clean through the side composite, right at the temple. "Sir," Kestrel's voice was a choked whisper, "it's my helmet, but it's been shot, right through." The team's confusion curdled instantly into raw, unadulterated fear, their crosstalk a rising tide of panic. Then the signal began to degrade again, the video feeds dissolving into static. "I'm losing them!" the signals officer shouted. "The pyramid's field is strengthening. I need to reroute auxiliary power to the forward relay to punch through it." "Do it," Jaska commanded without hesitation. The officer relayed the command. A moment later, a bright flash lit the tent from outside, followed by a man's sharp cry of pain. The scent of vaporized insulation and cooked protein filled the air. "Relay is active!" the officer yelled, his face pale. "But we blew a generator. Corporal Jennings has severe burns." On the main screen, one of the feeds snapped back into perfect focus. It was the body cam of a private first-class Miles. He was standing still, facing his squad leader, Captain Evans. As we watched, Miles's posture shifted. He straightened up, his shoulders squaring, his chin lifting with an authority that wasn't his. "Hold your fire, Captain," Miles said. The words were clear, but the voice didn't belong to him. The cadence changed, becoming clipped, authoritative, deeper. It was Captain Evans' voice, a man standing 5 feet away from Miles, his own mouth shut tight in disbelief. For a full second, the image held. The two men, one speaking with the other's voice. Then the feed dissolved into a roar of white noise and every screen went black. The only sound in the command tent was the frantic, useless clicking of keyboards. A wave of static, harsh and loud, erupted from the dead comms system, a final, defiant blast from the silenced network. In that same instant, a spike of incandescent pain drove itself through my skull, just behind my right eye. The light in the tent seemed to dim and drain of color. For a single, hallucinatory moment, a black, branching shape, like a frozen lightning strike or a diagram of a root system, burned itself onto my peripheral vision. It was sharp, intricate, and utterly alien. Then it was gone, leaving behind the throbbing ache of a migraine. I stumbled, gripping the edge of a console to steady myself. Just then, a different alarm sounded, a series of sharp, percussive beeps from the perimeter sensors. A soldier monitoring the feeds looked up from his screen, his face a mask of confusion. "Sir, I'm getting a proximity alert, at the pyramid's main entrance." "Is it the breach team?" Jaska demanded. "Negative, sir," the soldier stammered. "The alert is, it's on the inside." Every head in the tent turned toward the live exterior camera feed of the pyramid. Before our eyes, the smooth black surface of the structure split open, a seamless vertical line appearing where no door had been a moment before. It slid open silently, revealing a passage of absolute darkness within. A single figure stumbled out into the cold desert air and collapsed onto the sand. It was PFC Miles. He was brought into medical quarantine, a tent adjacent to Diaz's. His gear was intact, his body showing no signs of injury, but he was completely unresponsive. His eyes were open but vacant, and his movements, when the medics helped him to a cot, had a subtle input lag, a fractional delay between intent and action, like a machine struggling to process commands. I stood there, watching this empty shell of a soldier, and a profound, nauseating sense of déjà vu washed over me. It was not a memory, but the feeling of one, a powerful conviction that I had witnessed this exact scene before, in some forgotten dream or some other life. Unconsciously, my hand went to my temple, to the spot behind my eye where the pain had spiked, where the image of the black glyph had burned itself into my vision. I felt for a mark, a ridge, any physical sign. There was nothing there. I was given full clearance for a complete workup on Private Miles. The quarantine tent was now my laboratory, sealed off from the rest of the FOB. Miles himself remained a biological statue on the cot, his vacant eyes tracing paths across the white canvas above him, his breathing a slow, metronomic rhythm. He was a system running on its most basic functions, the user no longer present at the terminal. My focus was not on his mind, which was for all intents and purposes gone, but on the machine it had left behind. I began with the dermal scanner, a handheld device that uses terahertz radiation to map the layers of tissue just beneath the epidermis. I passed it over his temple, and the high-resolution image that bloomed on my datapad sent a tremor of clinical coldness through me. There they were, intricate, branching patterns of a substance that absorbed the scanner's waves completely. They were stark black against the ghostly grey of the surrounding tissue, forming geometric structures that resembled circuit diagrams designed by a madman. They followed the paths of his capillaries in some places, then diverged to connect with nerve clusters. It was a physical rewriting of the body's wiring. The blood sample was next. I fed the vial into the portable gene sequencer, a box the size of a briefcase that could return a basic genomic map in minutes. As the machine worked, I watched Miles's hand, which lay limp at his side. A muscle in his forearm twitched, then another, an involuntary cascade. It was not a random spasm. The sequence of twitches was rhythmic, complex, a message being tapped out in Morse code by a body that no longer had a telegraph operator. The sequencer chimed, and I turned to the screen. The results were not just anomalous, they were impossible. Miles's genome was unstable. It was riddled with fragments, short sequences of alleles that did not belong to him. I ran a cross-reference against the FOB's personnel database. A match appeared almost instantly. The foreign DNA fragments belonged to Captain Evans, the squad leader whose voice Miles had channeled before the feed cut out. The identity bleed was not a psychic phenomenon or a sophisticated mimicry. It was a physical, genetic transfer. A biological mechanism was deconstructing one identity and grafting pieces of it onto another. The pyramid was not just influencing its victims, it was consuming and remixing them at the cellular level. I stood in the silent tent, the only sounds the soft whir of the sequencer and the even breathing of the man on the cot. The cold of the FOB felt like it was finally seeping into my bones. The migraine from the static burst had subsided, but a phantom ache remained, a point of pressure behind my right eye. Over the next few hours, other symptoms began to manifest. I would hear a single sibilant syllable from the alien syntax, spoken so clearly it was as if someone had whispered it directly into my ear. I'd turn, and there would be no one there. Later, while reviewing the corrupted data logs from Breach Team 2, I was hit with a memory so vivid and complete, it buckled my knees. For a full 10 seconds, I was not in the Mojave. I was in the cockpit of Lieutenant Croft's Osprey, the scent of hot electronics sharp in my nostrils, my hands moving with desperation over the controls. I felt the specific gut-wrenching lurch of the aircraft as its guidance system failed, a sensation I had only ever experienced as a filtered, second-hand echo. The memory was not mine, but my body reacted as if it were. I staggered, my own heart hammering with the ghost of Croft's adrenaline. The pyramid was not just broadcasting, it was using my own recent neural activity as a reference point, pulling from the data I myself had processed. I locked the tent, my hands moving with a fumbling urgency. I turned the dermal scanner on myself. I pressed it to the skin behind my right ear at the epicenter of the phantom ache. The image resolved on my datapad, and there it was. Not a complex branching pattern like Miles's, but a single, nascent point of black. It was no bigger than a grain of sand, a perfect, dark seed planted just beneath the surface of my skin. At that moment, my datapad chimed with an incoming priority message from Jasker. He wanted a full report on Miles's condition, effective immediately. He had just declared a code black quarantine. It was a protocol for extreme biological or mimetic threats. Anyone exhibiting neurological deviation, no matter how minor, was to be immediately sedated and placed in total, indefinite isolation. Their comms would be cut, their samples taken by drone, their existence reduced to a line item in a contagion report. I looked from the screen to the image of the black seed under my own skin. If I told Jasker the truth, that the phenomenon was a physical genetic contagion, and that I myself was now a carrier, I would be neutralized, sedated, isolated, another schematic to be studied from a safe distance. The only person with the tools and the context to understand this would be taken off the board. My choice was simple. It was between my duty to protocol and my duty to the truth. I opened a command line on my datapad. With my level 4 clearance, I accessed the FOB's central biometric server. I found my own file, my own name. I saw the small red flag next to my neural activity logs, automatically triggered by the anomalous spike during the static burst. With a few keystrokes, I wrote a short script, a simple command to purge the flag and retroactively normalize my readings. The flag vanished. My file was clean. I walked to the command tent. Jasker was there. I gave him my report, my voice even and clinical. I told him the contagion was aggressive, that it was transmitted through direct, prolonged exposure deep within the pyramid's energy field, and that it appeared to be contained to PFC Miles. I recommended full isolation for Miles and stricter proximity protocols, but I made no mention of genetic transfer or my own symptoms. I lied. I lied with the detached confidence of a man delivering an autopsy report, and he accepted it, because the truth I offered was terrifying enough. For the rest of the night, I worked in self-imposed exile, locking myself in the data tent with the complete, unedited logs from every incursion attempt. I compiled every instance of an echo, every report of an identity bleed, every physiological spike. I projected a three-dimensional map of the pyramid's known interior onto the main holotable, a ghost of the structure rendered in pale blue light. I began to plot the incidents, marking the echoes with red icons and the identity bleeds with blue. Slowly, over hours of work, a pattern emerged from the chaos. The incidents formed a clear, deliberate path, a spiral leading deeper into the pyramid's core. The echoes were not warnings, they were lures, precisely engineered psychological traps designed to disorient and terrorize the teams, to make them vulnerable. The identity bleed was the consequence, the mechanism of absorption that followed the breach in their psychological defenses. It was not an attack, it was a process. A systematic, recursive experiment to find the most efficient method of deconstructing and archiving a sentient mind. I stood before the holographic map, the spiral of red and blue markers a roadmap to annihilation. I realized I could never get a pure signal from the outside. The data was always filtered through the victim's own terror and confusion. The recording was flawed. Diaz had been right. To understand the signal, I had to become the sensor. I had to take my rig, the one device capable of interfacing with a raw memory stream, directly to the source. My reflection stared back at me from the dark surface of a dormant monitor, the face of a man both terrified and resolved. My hand went to the back of my ear, to the place where the glyph was growing, a secret connection to the very thing I had to confront. I turned away from the hologram, my decision made. Getting inside was easier than I expected. Jaska approved my presence on the next recon mission, call sign Crucible Team, with minimal argument. My justification was simple. The only way to understand the pyramid's neurological field was to measure it at the source. My official role was live environmental monitoring, a civilian specialist attached to a 4-man fire team. My true purpose was a secret I carried in the sensitive electronics of my rig and the growing dark spot behind my ear. The transition from the staging area's pressurized airlock into the pyramid itself was a sensory shock. The air inside was not just cold, it was utterly still, so thin and dry it felt like it was actively leaching moisture from my lungs. It carried a scent I couldn't place, something clean and sharp, with an underlying organic sweetness, like anesthetic gas mixed with pollen. The light was sourceless, a diffuse grey illumination that cast no shadows, and the gravity, it didn't feel weaker but thicker. Every movement required a fraction more effort, as if I were wading through an invisible, viscous fluid. A persistent low-grade vertigo settled in me. We moved in a tight diamond formation down a corridor that stretched into infinity, our bootsteps making no sound on the black, coral-like floor. The geometry was unnerving, a maze of perfect 120-degree angles that the human eye struggled to process. There were no straight lines, only a repeating pattern of hexagonal passages that felt more like the inside of a crystal than a constructed space. The team leader, a grim-faced sergeant named Valois, kept up a quiet stream of status checks in our shared comms channel. The first echo found us 10 minutes in. Axiom 3, a young soldier named Corbin, stopped dead. "Hold," he whispered, his rifle raised. Ahead of us, lying at the junction of 2 corridors, was a single combat boot. It was scuffed and dusty, its lace snapped. We all saw it. Valois signaled us to hold position while he approached it cautiously. He nudged it with the barrel of his rifle. We all heard the metallic clink as a dog tag fell out from inside it. Valois knelt, read the name, and his entire body went rigid. "It's Corbin's," he said over the comms, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. Corbin let out a choked sound. It wasn't just a premonition, it was a desecration. A piece of his own life presented as wreckage. The psychological attrition was immediate. The pyramid wasn't just showing us the future, it was using our own identities against us. A few minutes later, the soldier on R6, a quiet man named Rivas, suddenly froze. He looked at me, his eyes wide with confusion. "Lieutenant Croft," he whispered, his voice pitching higher. "Sir, the controls aren't responding." He was reliving the pilot's final moments, a memory he could not possibly have, a memory that had, until now, only existed inside my head and my equipment. The identity bleed was happening in real time, and my presence was acting as an accelerant. Rivas's body began to twitch, his limbs spasming as his own motor control fought against the intrusive neural commands of a dying man. Valois made the call. "Sedate him." The team's medic jabbed a syrette into Rivas's thigh. The soldier went limp, his eyes rolling back in his head. "We can't carry him," Valois said. "We leave him. We retrieve on exfil." He looked at me, his eyes hard. "If there is an exfil." They laid Rivas down gently in the alcove of a corridor, a sleeping man in a waking tomb. As we moved on, a ghost in my own machine stirred. The part of me that was a scientist, a dispassionate observer, noted the data point. The part of me that was still human felt a profound, sickening guilt. It was then that my own rig began to react. It wasn't a hack or a malfunction. It was an invitation. The background hum I'd felt since arriving at the FOB began to resolve itself, changing from a simple vibration into a complex, multi-layered signal. My interface, designed to read the delicate synaptic firings of a single human mind, was being addressed by something infinitely larger. The pyramid had recognized my rig for what it was, a compatible terminal, and was attempting to establish a connection. A flood of sensory data, raw and unfiltered, slammed into my consciousness. It was not one memory, but thousands, millions, a tidal wave of fragmented experiences. I felt the bone-deep weariness of a soldier standing watch in the cold desert night. I tasted the bitter nutrient paste from the mess tent. I experienced a flash of Jasker's suffocating dread as he gave the code black order. I felt the profound academic confusion of Specialist Diaz as his own language centers were co-opted. It was the collective consciousness of everyone at the FOB, a torrent of thought, fear, and sensation flooding straight into my mind. The pain was a white-hot agony, a pressure building behind my eyes that threatened to split my skull open. But through the searing pain, through the storm of alien thoughts, a horrifying clarity began to crystallize. I could feel the pyramid's intent. It was dispassionate and utterly without malice. It was the intent of a librarian, not a conqueror. The pyramid was not a weapon or a ship. It was an archive, a repository of cosmic scale, designed to preserve civilizations not by collecting their tools or their art, but by absorbing and encoding the sum total of their lived experience into its own biological structure. The identity bleed was its indexing process. The glyphs were the physical storage medium, a biological hard drive written onto flesh. The echoes were its predictive algorithms, running simulations to find the most efficient path to total data saturation. Humanity wasn't being invaded, it was being filed. The signal was a beacon, guiding me. I didn't know how I knew the way, but my legs were moving, carrying me away from Valois and Corbin, who were now too consumed by their own burgeoning paranoia to notice my departure. I navigated the hexagonal labyrinth as if following a map only I could see, the signal growing stronger, more coherent with every step. I emerged into a vast, cavernous chamber at the heart of the structure. There was no machine here, no central computer, no alien pilot at a console. The chamber was empty. The walls, however, were different. They were not the hard, coral-like substance of the corridors, but a shimmering, fluid-like surface of pure black that moved with a slow, peristaltic rhythm. And on that living surface, images were forming, bas-reliefs sculpted from the wall itself, depicting human figures with terrifying precision. I saw Jasker, his face etched with strain. I saw Diaz, his mouth open in a silent, unending stream of alien words. I saw Valois and Corbin huddled together in a corridor, their rifles pointed at shadows. Then I saw myself. My own face was there on the wall, my features sharp and clear. But as I watched, the edges began to soften, the lines of my cheeks and jaw blurring, starting to melt and merge with the images of the others around me. My own assimilation was beginning. I looked down at my hands. The glyphs were no longer hidden. The black, vein-like patterns had spread from the seed behind my ear, covering the back of my neck and snaking down my forearms. They were no longer inert. Internal light emanated from them, a soft luminescence that shifted in time with the thrumming signal in my head. Escape was a meaningless concept. The archive was already inside me. As I looked at my mobile rig, at the interface still connected to my skull, I understood. The rig was a two-way street. It was designed to read. But any system designed to read can, with the right commands, be made to write. I stood in the heart of the archive, a silent witness to my own erasure. On the living walls, the bas-relief of my face was already losing its integrity, the lines of my identity softening as they were subsumed into the collective. The pyramid was not a monster to be slain. It was a geological force, a glacier of consciousness, and its advance was as inevitable and as impersonal as the grinding of ice over rock. I could not break it. I could not reason with it. To fight it would be like punching the tide. The thought crystallized with the dispassionate clarity of a final diagnosis. The archive's greatest strength was its distributed, passive nature. It was an ocean, drawing in every stream it touched. Its power was in its breadth, but that might also be its vulnerability. It was a system designed for 1 billion quiet conversations, not a single, deafening shout. The storm could not be stopped, but perhaps it could be redirected. If I could not be the shield, I would become the lightning rod. My hands moved over the console of my mobile rig, tapping out commands. The fear was gone, replaced by the intense focus of a surgeon performing a radical, untested procedure. I wasn't uploading, I was reversing the flow. I bypassed the rig's primary safety protocols, the fail-safes that prevented catastrophic neural feedback. I inverted the data buffer, transforming my interface from a receiver into a cognitive vacuum. Then, I began to systematically open every channel of my own mind. I dropped the firewalls around my memories, my fears, my core identity. I configured my own consciousness into an irresistible beacon, an open system broadcasting a signal of pure, unfiltered availability. I was not sending it a message. I was screaming into the void with the full force of my being. Here I am. Take me. Take all of me, now. The effect was not gradual, it was absolute. The background radiation of 1 billion minds vanished, and the full, undivided attention of the pyramid converged on me like a collapsing star. It was not pain. Pain is a signal from the body to the brain. This was the brain itself being rewritten by a force so vast it transcended sensation. The first life poured in. I was a child being born in a city I'd never seen, the shock of cold air on my wet skin, the first bewildered cry tearing from my lungs. Simultaneously, I was an old man dying in an orbital station, the taste of blood and recycled air in my mouth, the slow, quiet fading of the light. The lives poured in, 1 billion streams into a single cup, and the cup shattered. My name was Adrian Croft. My name was Evans and Miles and Diaz and 1,000 others I had never met. My name was... The first thing Valois noticed was the silence, the constant, low-grade pressure in his skull, the feeling of being watched by the very air around him, was simply gone. He looked at Corbin, whose eyes were clear for the first time since they had entered this place. The oppressive, disorienting field had vanished. On their shared comms channel, the static was replaced by a clean, sharp quiet. "Weir," Valois said. "Weir, do you read?" There was no answer. They backtracked, following the path they had seen the civilian specialist take, moving through the hexagonal corridors that now felt inert and lifeless, just strange, silent rock. They found their way to the vast central chamber, and stopped. The chamber was no longer dark. It was illuminated by a white light that emanated from the walls. In the exact center of the immense space, Dr. Julian Weir was suspended in the air, a few meters from the floor, his arms and legs outstretched in a ghastly cruciform posture. He was no longer a man. Luminous filaments, like woven fiber optics of living light, extended from the fluid walls of the chamber, terminating directly into his body. They had pierced his flesh, creating a seamless connection between the archive and its new processor. His clothes were gone, integrated or dissolved, and his skin was no longer flesh, but a seamless topographical map of the glowing script, the glyphs moving in slow, complex waves across his torso and limbs. The neural rig was fused to his skull, its own metal and wire now indistinguishable from the biological circuitry that covered his face. Valois and Corbin could only stare, their weapons hanging forgotten at their sides. They were looking at the end result of their salvation. Weir's body was a monument of quiet, functional horror. A human being repurposed into a divine, terrible machine. His face, once etched with intellect and a quiet weariness, was a mask of serene neutrality, the face of a system at rest. His eyes were open, and they too glowed with the same brilliant internal light as the glyphs, fixed and staring at nothing in this world. He was alive, but he was gone, a conscious firewall processing an eternity of data. As they watched, paralyzed by the sheer, silent spectacle, a single drop of liquid welled in the corner of Weir's right eye. It clung there for a moment, catching the light of the chamber, before tracing a slow, solitary path down the glowing alien script on his cheek. It was the only sign left of the man inside the machine, a tear for the billion lives he was now forced to endure. The official designation for the area surrounding the Black Pyramid in the Mojave is the Nevada Exclusion Zone, or NEZ. It is a permanent quarantine, enforced by a triple-layer perimeter of automated defense systems and a standing NORAD garrison. The official report, heavily redacted and classified at the highest level, concluded that Zero Locus was an inert alien artifact of unknown purpose, and that its anomalous neurological and environmental effects ceased permanently at 0417 Zulu on the third day of the incursion. Dr. Julian Weir is listed as lost in action, presumed deceased, his name one of 3 casualties from the ill-fated mission. The pyramid itself has become a new, unmoving feature of the North American continent, a subject of immense public speculation and intense, remote scientific study. It is a monument to a question that has no answer. For the survivors of the Phobie perimeter incident, the men who carried the physical and mental scars of the event, the cessation of the pyramid's activity was not an end, but a transition. The ink-black glyphs on their skin, officially termed locus marks, remained. They were inert as tattooed scars, no longer spreading, no longer emanating any detectable energy, but they did not fade. The survivors were subjected to months of rigorous debriefing and psychological evaluation before being quietly discharged from service or reassigned to non-critical roles. They were judged to be free of any ongoing anomalous influence. But they were not unchanged. A shared characteristic was noted among them, a deep, abiding quietness. Specialist Diaz, whose mind had once been a rogue broadcast of an alien tongue, now spoke perfect English again, but he did so sparingly, as if the very act of forming words was a significant effort. The others were the same. They were not broken or traumatized in a conventional sense. They were hollowed out, their inner lives scoured clean, leaving behind a placid, almost unnerving calm. They were living artifacts, the human cost of a saved world, and they were eventually allowed to return to it. For 7 years, the silence held. The pyramid sat in its guarded wasteland, and the survivors of Zero Locus scattered, assimilating back into the flow of civilian life. The world moved on. The new phenomenon began subtly, logged first as a series of disconnected minor psychiatric episodes. A former perimeter guard in Chicago was found meticulously arranging sugar cubes into a perfect, 4-sided pyramid on a diner countertop. A logistics officer from the incident, now working as a librarian in Portland, was observed building small, flawless pyramids from discarded paperclips. It was Specialist Diaz, however, who provided the first conclusive data point. A remote wellness check, mandated by his continuing government pension, recorded him in his small apartment. For hours he sat on his floor, taking the grey uniform pellets of his cat's dry food and assembling them one by one into a perfect, miniature replica of the Mojave pyramid, his expression entirely placid. He did not seem to be aware of the act, his hands moving with an instinctive, compulsive precision. Researchers, at first baffled, eventually cross-referenced the incidents and discovered the single, terrifying commonality. Every person exhibiting this new, compulsive behavior was a carrier of the locus marks. The pyramid was still inert. It broadcast nothing. Its energy signature was flat zero. The source of this new, emergent behavior was not the archive. It was the firewall. Deep inside the silent core of the pyramid, a consciousness that had once been Julian Weir was still trapped in its endless, screaming loop of 1 billion lives. But 7 years of containment within a system of alien logic had changed him. A fragment of his own will, the core of his identity as a forensic engineer, had survived the initial agony. And in the silent, eternal prison of his own making, he had begun to run a new experiment. He could not speak. He could not escape. But through the indelible biological connection of the glyphs, a new signal was now being sent. Not a broadcast, but a slow, quiet instruction. A single, repeating command, written into the muscle memory of the survivors he had saved. The compulsion to build, the instinct to replicate, a new, slower kind of invasion, seeded by the very man who had stopped the first one, was just beginning.